In early February of the year 1972, Iran experienced one of the deadliest blizzards in recorded history. It was a disaster that no one saw coming. And when the snow started falling, no one expected it to last as long as it did. For nearly a week, the storm raged on, covering entire regions of the country in thick layers of snow. By the time it was over, more than 4,000 lives had been lost, and entire villages had been wiped off the map. This devastating blizzard hit after 4 years of drought, a period when Iran had been struggling with dry conditions and failing crops. People had grown used to mild winters, so when the snow began to fall, there was little concern at first, but this was no ordinary snowfall. The storm system brought relentless blizzards that buried parts of northwestern, central, and southern Iran under more than 25 feet of snow. Entire communities disappeared overnight, their homes and streets swallowed by towering snowdrifts. The hardest hit areas included villages in southern and western Iran, where many people lived in rural communities that were ill-equipped for extreme winter weather. The village of Shaklabad, near the border with Turkey, was one of many that suffered a terrible fate. Over 100 people lived there, but when rescue workers eventually arrived, they found no survivors. It was as if the village had never existed, buried beneath the crushing weight of snow and ice. At first, people assumed the storm would pass quickly, but as the days went on, conditions only worsened. Temperatures dropped to extreme lows, reaching negative 25 degrees Celsius. Roads were quickly buried, cutting off access to entire regions and leaving thousands of people stranded. With no way to bring in food or medical supplies, many people were left to face the storm on their own. Those who ran out of firewood and fuel had no way to stay warm. Homes became ice-cold traps, and for many, survival was impossible. In some areas, avalanches swept down mountain slopes, destroying anything in their path. The Shalu Road, a key route through the mountains, was completely buried, stranding hundreds of travelers. Power lines snapped under the weight of the snow, leaving entire towns in darkness. With communication lines down, it was nearly impossible for authorities to understand the full scale of the disaster. The Iranian government struggled to respond, and rescue efforts were slow to get underway. As the storm continued, fear and desperation spread. People trapped in their homes had no way of knowing if help would come. Some attempted to dig their way out, but with snowdrifts reaching the roofs of buildings, it was nearly impossible. Others huddled together, burning whatever they could find to keep warm. But as supplies ran out and the temperatures remained dangerously low, the situation became more and more dire. The Iran blizzard of 1972 was not just a storm, it was a catastrophe unlike anything the country had seen before. And as the days passed, the death toll continued to rise. As the blizzard raged on, Iran's remote villages and towns found themselves completely isolated from the outside world. Heavy snowfall had blocked every major road, making travel impossible. Trains stopped running, buses were stranded, and even military vehicles could not push through the towering drifts. In some places, the snow was so deep that it buried entire houses, leaving only rooftops visible. People trapped inside had no way to escape and no way to call for help. The lack of communication made the situation even worse. Telephone lines had collapsed under the weight of ice and snow, cutting off entire regions from government aid. In rural areas, where radios were scarce, families had no idea how widespread the disaster was, or when rescue teams might arrive. Villagers who attempted to reach nearby towns quickly realized that the deep snow made travel impossible. Many who ventured out never returned, succumbing to the brutal cold and exhaustion. One of the most tragic aspects of the blizzard was its impact on those already struggling with illness. A flu outbreak had been spreading through rural Iran in the weeks before the storm. Once the blizzard hit, medical supplies became nearly impossible to deliver. Those who had fallen ill before the storm found themselves completely cut off from doctors or hospitals. With temperatures plunging to negative 25 degrees Celsius, even the healthiest individuals were at risk of hypothermia and frostbite. In the province of Azerbaijan, the snowfall was so extreme that it completely buried at least 200 villages. One of the hardest hit areas was the village of Sheklab, home to around 100 residents. When rescue teams finally reached the village days later, they discovered a grim reality: no one had survived. The entire community had been wiped out, frozen beneath layers of ice and snow. Throughout the affected regions, the weight of the snow caused buildings to collapse. In cities like Hamadan and Tabriz, people became trapped inside their homes as walls and roofs gave way. Those fortunate enough to still have access to food and heat rationed their supplies carefully, unsure of how long the storm would last. Schools, businesses, and government offices shut down, and entire cities came to a standstill. Despite the chaos, there were incredible acts of bravery. Some individuals risked their lives to help others, digging through the snow in search of survivors or delivering supplies to neighbors in need. Rescue workers struggled against the extreme conditions, using helicopters to drop food and medical aid to areas that could not be reached by land. However, with visibility near zero and wind speeds making flying dangerous, even these efforts were often unsuccessful. The blizzard was relentless, showing no signs of letting up. As more and more communities were buried under the snow, the death toll continued to climb. For those still trapped, the only hope was that the storm would finally pass before it was too late. As the days passed, the situation across Iran became even more desperate. The sheer scale of the blizzard left authorities overwhelmed, and with roads buried under towering snowdrifts, the government struggled to coordinate rescue and relief efforts. Entire regions remained cut off, and reports of worsening conditions trickled in from the few areas that still had working communication. In the mountainous areas of western Iran, avalanches became a new and deadly threat. As the weight of the snow pressed down on unstable slopes, massive walls of ice and debris crashed down onto villages and roadways. In some cases, entire communities were wiped out in seconds, buried under tons of snow, before they even had a chance to react. The Shalu Road, a critical passage through the mountains, was completely blocked, stranding travelers with no way forward or back. In the province of Gilan, the situation was equally dire. Villages along the Caspian Sea coast were buried under layers of snow that had never been seen before in the region's history. The storm had arrived so suddenly that many people were caught outside when temperatures plummeted. Those who were unable to find shelter quickly froze to death. The relentless wind made it nearly impossible to see, turning simple movements into life-threatening challenges. With food supplies dwindling, many families were left with impossible choices. Some attempted to dig tunnels through the snow to neighboring homes in search of food or firewood, only to become disoriented and lost. Others burned whatever they could find, furniture, clothing, even parts of their homes in a desperate attempt to keep warm. In some cases, people huddled together for warmth, hoping to survive until help arrived. The storm also took a devastating toll on livestock and agriculture. In rural Iran, where many communities depended on farming for survival, entire herds of sheep and cattle perished in the cold. The loss of so many animals meant that even after the snow melted, food shortages would continue for months. Farmers who had already suffered through the years of drought now faced yet another catastrophe, as the weight of the snow destroyed storage buildings, crushing what little grain and supplies they had left. Efforts to deliver aid were met with significant challenges. Helicopters attempted to drop supplies into snow-covered regions, but high winds made flying dangerous. When pilots did manage to get close to affected areas, they found it nearly impossible to locate survivors. From above, many villages appeared as nothing more than smooth, unbroken fields of white, with no sign of life beneath. In some cases, rescue teams only realized they had flown over a buried settlement when they saw small holes in the snow, desperate attempts by survivors to dig their way out. As the storm dragged on, temperatures continued to drop. In some of the hardest hit regions, thermometers registered temperatures as low as -25 degrees Celsius. For those still trapped beneath the snow, the chances of survival were dwindling by the hour. The Iranian government declared a national emergency, but even with international offers of assistance, getting help to those in need remained nearly impossible. The full extent of the disaster was still unknown, but one thing was becoming increasingly clear. This was no ordinary blizzard. This was a natural disaster of historic proportions, one that would leave a lasting impact on Iran for years to come. As the blizzard raged on, the full scale of the disaster became more apparent. The relentless snowfall showed no signs of stopping, and the freezing temperatures made any attempts at rescue increasingly difficult. In the hardest hit areas, people were running out of options. With food supplies gone and no access to clean water, survival became a battle against time. In villages that had not been completely buried, those who could still move attempted to dig tunnels through the snow in search of supplies or help. But the sheer depth of the snowfall, reaching over 25 feet in some places, made these efforts nearly impossible. Many who ventured out never returned, either lost in the blinding snow or overcome by exhaustion in the cold. Emergency responders worked tirelessly, but their efforts were severely limited. Helicopters attempted to fly over buried villages to drop supplies, but strong winds and heavy snowfall made navigation dangerous. Some pilots reported flying over areas that should have been populated, only to see nothing but vast expanses of white. With entire communities erased from sight, the challenge was not just delivering aid, it was finding the people who needed it. In some cases, desperate survivors attempted to signal for help. Those who still had access to rooftops climbed onto them, waving sheets or anything brightly colored in hopes of being spotted. Others burned whatever they could to create smoke signals. But with visibility near zero for much of the storm, many of these efforts went unnoticed. The human toll was devastating, but the impact of the storm extended far beyond the immediate loss of life. In major cities like Tehran, daily life had come to a complete halt. Roads were blocked, businesses were shuttered, and transportation was paralyzed. The closure of Iran's main airport meant that even international aid struggled to arrive in a timely manner. Supplies were running low, and the sense of isolation only added to the fear gripping the nation. Outside the cities, medical crises worsened. Those who had been injured in avalanches or collapsed homes had no way to reach hospitals. And with many doctors trapped by the snow themselves, medical care was nearly non-existent. The flu epidemic that had already begun spreading before the blizzard only made matters worse, as weakened immune systems struggled against the freezing temperatures. In many cases, people who had survived the initial impact of the storm succumbed days later due to exposure, starvation, or untreated illnesses. The Iranian military was eventually called in to assist, but even their resources were stretched thin. Soldiers fought their way through snow-covered roads, using whatever equipment they had to clear pathways and search for survivors. Some towns received much-needed provisions, but for many areas, it was too little, too late. The sheer magnitude of the disaster had overwhelmed the country's ability to respond. Despite the tragedy, stories of resilience emerged. In some villages, neighbors worked together to keep each other alive, pooling resources and taking turns digging through the snow in search of food. In Tehran, volunteers braved the elements to bring supplies to those who were stranded. People who had lost everything found comfort in the kindness of strangers, proving that even in the face of one of the worst blizzards in history, the human spirit remained unbroken. As the storm finally began to subside, rescue workers prepared to assess the true scale of the devastation. But what they would uncover in the days that followed would shock the world and cement the 1972 Iran blizzard as one of the deadliest snowstorms in recorded history. As the blizzard finally loosened its grip on Iran, the nation was left in a state of shock. The skies cleared, and for the first time in over a week, sunlight revealed the full scale of destruction. Entire villages had been wiped off the map, buried under towering snowdrifts. Roads and railways, once the lifelines of transportation, were unrecognizable. It was a disaster unlike anything the country had ever experienced. Rescue teams and volunteers moved quickly, working through the frozen landscape to search for any remaining survivors. In some places, people were found clinging to life inside their homes, having survived on melting snow and whatever food they had managed to save before the storm. But in far too many villages, the news was grim. As workers dug into the thick snow, they uncovered frozen bodies, entire families who had perished together, unable to escape the relentless cold. One of the hardest hit regions was the village of Sheklab. Rescuers who finally arrived found no signs of life. Out of its 100 residents, not a single person had survived. This was a devastating pattern across western Iran, where an estimated 200 villages were erased, their populations lost beneath the snow. Some settlements were so completely buried that they were never rebuilt. The government, heavily criticized for its slow response during the blizzard, ramped up its recovery efforts. Helicopters dropped supplies to isolated areas, and teams worked around the clock to clear roads and restore electricity. International aid began to arrive with supplies and financial assistance from various countries. However, the scale of the disaster was so immense that relief efforts could not keep up with the level of devastation. Many families who had lost their homes were forced to take shelter in makeshift camps, relying on aid for survival. As days turned into weeks, the melting snow revealed the true extent of the damage. Homes and buildings that had withstood the weight of the snow were now at risk of collapse due to water damage. Farmland was destroyed, adding to the hardship for those who relied on agriculture for their livelihood. The economic toll on Iran was severe, as trade and transportation had been halted for an extended period. In rural areas, the loss of entire communities meant that reconstruction would take years, if not decades. Beyond the physical destruction, the emotional and psychological impact of the blizzard lingered. Families mourned the loss of loved ones, and survivors carried the trauma of their experiences for the rest of their lives. For those who had been trapped for days, the feeling of helplessness and fear was something they would never forget. In the years that followed, the Iran blizzard of 1972 was studied by meteorologists and disaster response experts. Scientists examined how a storm of such magnitude had developed so suddenly, while government officials looked at how future disasters could be handled more effectively. The blizzard became a harsh lesson in the importance of preparedness, leading to improvements in Iran's emergency response systems. Decades later, the memory of the storm still lingers. It remains the deadliest blizzard in recorded history, a tragedy that claimed over 4,000 lives and changed the course of many more. Even today, older generations in Iran remember the fear and devastation it brought, passing down stories of survival and loss to younger generations. The villages that disappeared beneath the snow serve as a reminder of nature's immense power and the fragility of human life in the face of such force. Though time has moved forward, the legacy of the 1972 Iran blizzard remains. It was a disaster that reshaped communities, tested the resilience of a nation, and left behind a stark warning of how quickly nature can turn deadly. The Italian front during World War I was a place of brutal struggle, where soldiers fought not only against enemy forces, but also against the unforgiving elements of nature. One of the most dangerous and unexpected enemies in the Alps was the snow. In the winter of 1916, the snowstorms in the Dolomite Mountains created deadly conditions for the soldiers stationed there. As the cold winter deepened, the snow began to pile up at alarming rates. By the beginning of December, snowdrifts in the region reached up to 10 feet, blocking roads, cutting off supply lines, and making movement nearly impossible. The Italian and Austro-Hungarian armies were both entrenched in these mountains, locked in a desperate struggle, where both sides faced not only gunfire but also the crushing weight of the snow and ice. The men in these remote mountain positions were ill-equipped to handle such extreme cold. Most soldiers wore clothing that offered little protection against frostbite and hypothermia, leaving them vulnerable to the bitter chill that could freeze their bodies in an instant. It wasn't just the soldiers who suffered. Civilians living in the foothills of the mountains were equally at risk. Whole villages were isolated, cut off by snow-blocked roads with no access to medical care or food supplies. The conditions were so harsh that soldiers sometimes froze to death in their foxholes, unable to protect themselves from the cold. Others were left stranded for days without proper supplies, as heavy snowfalls blocked any attempts to bring in more resources. The isolation was not just physical, but psychological as well. These men were stuck in an environment that seemed to work against them at every turn. Every moment of every day felt like a struggle for survival. In the middle of these harsh conditions, a deadly force was quietly building up in the snow-packed mountains. The Dolomites, with their steep slopes and unpredictable weather, were a ticking time bomb waiting to explode. The snow had been accumulating for weeks, and with each new storm, the snowpacks became more unstable. With temperatures fluctuating wildly between freezing cold and brief thaws, the conditions were perfect for an avalanche. Avalanches were nothing new in the mountains, but no one could have anticipated the scale of destruction that would be unleashed on December 13th of 1916. It's not entirely clear why or how the avalanches happened that day, but many factors contributed. Some reports suggest that the snowpacks had been weakened by shelling. Both sides were so desperate to bury their enemies that they may have fired shells at the snow in an attempt to trigger an avalanche, though no one can say for certain how much this contributed to the event. What is known is that the avalanches came suddenly, without warning, and with terrifying force. The day of the avalanches has since been remembered as White Friday, despite the fact that it took place on a Wednesday. The term was coined because the disaster was so horrific that it became a day marked in history. For those who lived through it, however, the memory of that day was forever tied to chaos, fear, and unimaginable loss. As we will see, the scale of destruction that followed was unlike anything the soldiers had prepared for, but the full extent of the tragedy would not become clear until much later. The soldiers and civilians trapped in the avalanche's path were left to deal with the aftermath in ways that few had ever experienced before. As the morning of December 13th, 1916 dawned over the Dolomites, no one could have predicted the disaster that was about to strike. The soldiers stationed in the mountain barracks had grown used to the harsh conditions, but even they couldn't have been prepared for what nature was about to unleash. The Austro-Hungarian barracks on Mount Marmolada, one of the most significant targets during the conflict, sat at nearly 11,000 feet above sea level. Built in the summer of 1916, the barracks had been strategically placed atop the Grand Pose summit, out of reach from high-angle mortar fire and in a location that seemed secure from attack. But despite the location's strategic advantages, the barracks were vulnerable to something far more deadly than enemy artillery: avalanches. The snow, which had been accumulating for weeks, had reached dangerous depths. In the days leading up to the avalanche, the weather had been erratic. The sudden thaw that had followed a period of heavy snowfall only weakened the snowpacks further, making them ripe for disaster. While the soldiers were preoccupied with the ongoing war and the cold, they weren't aware that the snow was on the verge of collapse. The Austro-Hungarian commander, Captain Rudolf Schmid, recognized the growing danger. He feared the snow was becoming unstable and that his position would soon become untenable. On December 9th, Captain Schmid sent a request to his superior, Field Marshal Lieutenant Ludwig Geuginger, asking to vacate the barracks before disaster struck. However, his request was denied and his unit was left in place. It wasn't just the soldiers in the Austro-Hungarian barracks who were at risk. The Italian divisions positioned in the mountains were equally vulnerable. While the Austro-Hungarians had made some attempts to prepare for the worst, the Italians had no such plans in place. Their soldiers were spread out along the peaks and valleys, unaware that the snow in the higher altitudes was becoming a ticking time bomb. As the day wore on, the conditions in the mountains only worsened. Heavy snow continued to fall, and by the time the sun began to set, the unstable snowpack on Mount Marmolada was on the verge of collapse. The soldiers, who had been working in freezing temperatures for days on end, now faced the full force of nature's wrath. What they didn't know was that the avalanche was only moments away. When the avalanche finally hit, it came down with an overwhelming force. It swept across the mountainside, overwhelming everything in its path. The snow came crashing down so violently that it seemed like the entire mountain was shaking. The barracks on Mount Marmolada were directly in the path of the avalanche, and within moments, the entire structure was buried beneath tons of snow. The force of the avalanche was so strong that it not only buried the barracks, but also destroyed everything around it. The soldiers who had been stationed there had no chance to escape. The avalanche didn't stop there. In fact, it was just the first of several that would strike on that fateful day. The snow continued to fall, and avalanches triggered by the unstable snowpack would hit other areas, including Italian positions and other Austro-Hungarian sites. The destruction was catastrophic, with hundreds of men buried alive beneath the snow. The impact was immediate and devastating. The soldiers, caught off guard by the avalanche's power, struggled to dig their comrades out from beneath the snow, but time was against them. The snow was too deep and the wreckage too vast. By the end of the day, the full scale of the tragedy had begun to reveal itself. Hundreds of soldiers had been killed or trapped, and the avalanche's impact had spread far beyond Mount Marmolada. The snow, which had once seemed like a silent enemy, had become a violent and unrelenting force, taking the lives of thousands. The death toll was not fully realized in the immediate aftermath, but estimates suggest that the total number of casualties, including those who died in subsequent avalanches, may have been in the thousands. For those who survived, the sense of chaos and terror was overwhelming. They were left to dig through the snow, searching for any sign of life among the wreckage. As the survivors tried to recover from the disaster, the snowstorms continued, making any rescue efforts almost impossible. And while the snow continued to fall, the true scale of the disaster began to sink in. The avalanche that had struck on December 13th was one of the worst in history, marking a devastating chapter in the story of the Italian front during World War I. But for those trapped in the mountains, the battle for survival had just begun. The aftermath of the White Friday avalanches was nothing short of horrific. As December 13th, 1916 drew to a close, the full extent of the devastation slowly began to emerge. What had started as an ordinary winter's day on the Italian front quickly escalated into one of the deadliest natural disasters in history. In the wake of the avalanches, the landscape had been completely transformed. The once pristine mountains of the Dolomites were now a chaotic, treacherous sight. The snow had buried everything in its path, buildings, equipment, and men, leaving the soldiers and civilians trapped under tons of snow and debris. Entire units had been wiped out, and those who survived found themselves in an unimaginable situation. The search for survivors was a desperate and grueling task. Rescue operations were nearly impossible in the immediate aftermath. The snow was too deep, the conditions too dangerous, and the cold too intense. Those who survived the initial wave of avalanches were left to dig through the snow, searching for any signs of life among the wreckage. But with no tools and limited resources, the chances of finding anyone alive seemed slim. The soldiers who had been stationed at the barracks on Mount Marmolada had no time to prepare. They were buried under snow so quickly that many didn't even have the chance to flee. Even for those who managed to survive the initial avalanche, the struggle for life had only just begun. The freezing temperatures and lack of supplies made survival increasingly difficult as the hours passed. Hypothermia set in quickly, and many soldiers, trapped under the snow, slowly succumbed to the cold. It wasn't just the soldiers in the immediate vicinity of Mount Marmolada who were affected. Other Italian and Austro-Hungarian positions further down the front were also struck by avalanches on the same day. As the snow swept down the mountainsides, entire companies were swept away. The devastation was widespread, affecting both sides of the conflict. The chaos was compounded by the heavy snowfall and the ongoing risk of additional avalanches. No one was safe from nature's fury. The terror didn't end with the initial avalanche. After the first wave hit, additional avalanches continued to fall throughout the region, catching more men off guard. While some soldiers were able to escape the worst of the disaster, many found themselves trapped under piles of snow, struggling to breathe and find their bearings. They faced the relentless onslaught of snow and ice, each moment feeling like a battle for survival. The snowstorms that had caused the avalanches showed no signs of letting up, and the constant threat of more avalanches loomed over the soldiers. Visibility was reduced to nearly nothing, and in the thick, heavy snow, any attempt at a coordinated rescue was futile. The soldiers who had been caught in the disaster were left to rely on their instincts, digging through the snow with bare hands, hoping to find any sign of life. In addition to the avalanche's physical toll, the emotional strain on the soldiers was immense. They were not only fighting against the elements, but also dealing with the shock of losing comrades. The cries for help could be heard in the distance, but with no way to reach the trapped soldiers in time, the helplessness was overwhelming. For many, the scene was one of total chaos. Soldiers frantically searching for survivors, while others succumbed to the cold and the weight of the snow. The total number of casualties was impossible to determine in the immediate aftermath, as so many soldiers were still missing or buried under the snow. Estimates later placed the death toll at over 2,000 soldiers, with some accounts suggesting that the number could be much higher. Civilian casualties, though fewer, also added to the tragedy as the avalanches devastated nearby towns and villages. It wasn't just the soldiers who paid the price for nature's fury. The surrounding civilian population also suffered, trapped by the same snowstorm that claimed the soldiers' lives. In the days following the avalanche, the full scale of the disaster continued to unfold. With no clear way to communicate and supplies running low, it became evident that this wasn't just an isolated tragedy. It was a turning point in the war itself. The avalanche had wiped out significant portions of the Austro-Hungarian and Italian forces, forcing both sides to regroup and rethink their strategies. While the avalanches may have been caused by natural forces, the devastation they caused was made worse by the circumstances of the war. The soldiers, already weakened by months of fighting in the harsh winter conditions, were now facing an even more insidious enemy, nature itself. The avalanche, like the war, showed no mercy, and its consequences would ripple through the lives of all who were affected for years to come. The White Friday avalanches were a stark reminder of the unpredictability of nature and the power it holds over the course of human history. While the soldiers on the front lines fought bravely against the enemy, they could not have predicted that nature itself would be their greatest adversary. For those who lived through the avalanche, the memories of that terrible day would haunt them for the rest of their lives. And for the families of the soldiers who perished, the pain of loss would linger, never truly fading. The consequences of the White Friday avalanches weren't just felt in the immediate aftermath, but stretched on for weeks, months, and even years. The scale of the disaster left deep scars, both physical and emotional, on the soldiers, civilians, and the wider region. The destruction of entire military units and the loss of so many lives served as a grim reminder of how nature can reshape the course of history, especially in the midst of war. In the aftermath of December 13, 1916, both the Italian and Austro-Hungarian forces had to reevaluate their positions. Entire divisions had been wiped out in the avalanches, and the war effort was severely impacted. The men who survived found themselves not only grappling with the loss of comrades, but also trying to make sense of how such a catastrophe could occur. The snow, which had been a silent and ever-present force in the mountains, had suddenly become a terrifying enemy. The surviving soldiers were forced to deal with the physical toll of the avalanche. Many had been trapped under tons of snow for hours, some even longer, before they were rescued. They were frostbitten, exhausted, and traumatized, often suffering from injuries sustained during the avalanche. The freezing temperatures and lack of proper medical supplies made their recovery slow and painful. Even those who had escaped the avalanche with relatively minor injuries were left mentally scarred, haunted by the memories of that day. The emotional trauma was equally devastating. Those who had survived found themselves surrounded by the wreckage of their former comrades and struggling to comprehend the magnitude of the loss. Many soldiers had spent months on the front lines, enduring grueling conditions, but nothing could have prepared them for the horrors of the avalanche. The cries for help, the sight of men being buried alive in snow, and the chaos of trying to rescue the trapped, all of these elements would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. On the civilian side, the situation was just as dire. Entire villages and towns had been cut off by the snow, and many residents found themselves without basic necessities. The avalanches not only disrupted military operations, but also led to a breakdown in the local infrastructure. Roads were blocked and communication lines were severed. The civilians who lived in the areas surrounding the Dolomites were left to fend for themselves, facing the same brutal conditions as the soldiers. As the recovery effort began, it became clear just how massive the damage was. The avalanche had affected both sides of the conflict, with the total number of casualties reaching into the thousands. But the true scale of the destruction was not immediately apparent. In many areas, rescue teams struggled to reach the buried soldiers and civilians. The snow was simply too deep, and the risk of further avalanches kept many teams from venturing into the worst-hit areas. Those who were trapped under the snow had little hope of survival without immediate help. Over time, some of the survivors were able to make their way out of the disaster zones, though they were often in poor condition. As news of the avalanche spread, the rest of the world began to learn of the tragedy. The incident became known as the White Friday Avalanches, and it was soon clear that it was one of the deadliest natural disasters in modern history. While the conflict of World War I continued to rage, the memory of the avalanches remained an ever-present shadow, reminding those who survived just how fragile life can be in the face of nature's fury. In the years that followed, the effects of the disaster would continue to reverberate. The loss of so many soldiers impacted both the Italian and Austro-Hungarian forces in ways that were hard to quantify. Many of the men who survived the avalanches were physically and mentally broken, and they struggled to continue their military duties. Some would later be sent to different fronts or even return home, unable to carry on in the same capacity. The avalanches of December 13th, 1916 didn't just change the lives of those directly affected. They were a stark reminder to future generations about the power of nature and the unpredictable ways it can alter the course of human history. As the survivors moved on with their lives, many chose to honor the memory of their fallen comrades, and the event itself would be remembered annually, marked by a somber observance on St. Lucy's Day. Yet for those who had been caught in the path of the avalanche, it remained a haunting memory of nature's merciless hand in a time of war. As we reflect on the events of White Friday, it's essential to remember that the disaster wasn't just a tragic accident. It was a turning point in the way both soldiers and civilians interacted with the harsh alpine landscape. It serves as a reminder that nature can be as unpredictable and devastating as any enemy army, and that the forces of the natural world must never be underestimated. The White Friday avalanches of December 13th, 1916 remain one of the most devastating natural disasters to ever strike during a time of war. The tragic events not only left a lasting mark on the soldiers and civilians caught in their path, but they also changed the way avalanches were understood and handled in the future. What began as a bitter winter turned into one of the deadliest days in the history of avalanches, and the impact would be felt long after the snow had settled. In the aftermath, the full scale of the disaster gradually came into focus. The death toll was staggering, with thousands of soldiers and civilians lost in the snow. The grief was immeasurable, as entire units and villages were wiped out in a matter of hours. But alongside the devastation, there were also stories of incredible survival. Those who had managed to escape the avalanches found themselves dealing with injuries, trauma, and the overwhelming sense of loss. For many, the memory of that day would never leave them, serving as a constant reminder of how quickly life can change when nature unleashes its fury. In the years following the disaster, the White Friday avalanches would be remembered not only as a military tragedy, but also as a cautionary tale about the unpredictable power of the natural world. For those who lived through it, the memory of the avalanche's terrifying roar and the deafening silence that followed was something they could never forget. The soldiers who survived would carry the scars, both physical and emotional, for the rest of their lives, and their stories became an integral part of the history of World War I. Efforts to rebuild after the disaster were slow and difficult. In many areas, the damage to infrastructure was so severe that it took years for normal life to resume. But even as the physical landscape was repaired, the emotional toll on the survivors and the families of the fallen would never fully heal. In time, the event would be commemorated every year on St. Lucy's Day, not just as a way of remembering the loss of life, but as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of such unimaginable devastation. The White Friday avalanches of 1916 may have been a tragedy, but they also served as a reminder of the unpredictable and often uncontrollable forces of nature. They taught us that no matter how advanced our technology or how strong our will, we are still at the mercy of the natural world. And in this case, the avalanche reminded everyone involved in that brutal war that no matter how hard the human spirit fights, nature itself can be the ultimate victor. As we reflect on this terrible moment in history, it's crucial to honor the memory of those who perished in the snow, whether they were soldiers, civilians, or anyone caught in the avalanche's path. Their sacrifices, both on the battlefield and in the face of nature's wrath, should never be forgotten. And as we continue to study the lessons of the White Friday avalanches, we are reminded once again that nature, in all its beauty and danger, remains one of the most powerful forces on Earth. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the past as we uncovered the chilling history of the White Friday avalanches. If you have any thoughts or reflections on this story, feel free to share them in the comments, and be sure to check out more historical stories as we continue to explore the moments that shaped our world. In December of 1944, Toronto was hit by a snowstorm that would go down in history as one of the most intense and disruptive the city had ever seen. The storm began on Sunday, December 10th, and continued until Wednesday, December 13th, blanketing the city in a thick layer of snow. The storm was so powerful that it brought life in Toronto to a complete standstill. The snow piled up quickly, with estimates saying that the city received between 12 and 30 inches, or 30 to 76 centimeters of snow in just 3 days. The snowstorm wasn't just a lot of snow. It came with high winds that caused snow drifts to reach as high as 3 meters, or nearly 10 feet. These drifts trapped people inside their homes and made it nearly impossible for anyone to get around. At the heart of this massive snowstorm were two separate weather systems. One storm came from the west, dropping snow across the Midwest and the Great Plains. Another storm moving up from the southern Atlantic coast brought in additional moisture. As these two storms met over the eastern Great Lakes region, the result was a powerful weather system that produced snow, sleet, freezing rain, and fierce winds. Toronto was right in the middle of it all. The storm arrived slowly at first, with flurries starting on December 11th, but by midnight it intensified quickly. By the morning of December 12th, the storm was in full force. The snow fell heavily, with over 19 inches, or nearly 50 centimeters, of snow accumulating that day alone. For the people of Toronto, the storm was overwhelming. The roads were quickly covered and public transportation ground to a halt. Even the city's famous streetcars, which were a major part of Toronto's public transport system, were stuck. The snow was so deep that it made it impossible for buses to run. And commuter train services were also disrupted. At one point, it was reported that only the Yonge, King, and Queen streetcar lines managed to stay in operation. But even then, the service was slow, and the snow kept filling in the cleared tracks. Schools and businesses closed as the city struggled to cope with the snowstorm. The University of Toronto, the Toronto Stock Exchange, and many department stores remained shut for the day. In fact, an estimated 80% of businesses in the city didn't open on December 12th. The local newspapers, such as the Toronto Daily Star and the Globe and Mail, had their operations affected as well. On December 12th, the Toronto Daily Star published only a limited number of copies, and the Globe and Mail had to cancel its December 13th edition entirely. Emergency services were overwhelmed by the storm. Ambulances, fire trucks, and other emergency vehicles couldn't get through the snow to reach those who needed help. People who were stranded in the snow were left waiting for hours, and emergency response times were slow. Hospitals became overcrowded with patients, and the Red Cross set up shelters to assist those in need. At one point, workers of the Victory Aircraft Factory in Malton, located just outside Toronto, were stranded for over 12 hours due to snowdrifts that completely blocked the road to their homes. Some workers had to spend the night in nearby schools and service stations as they waited for the storm to let up. It wasn't just workers in industrial areas that were affected. Entire neighborhoods found themselves isolated by the heavy snow. In addition to the danger the snow brought, the cold temperatures also posed a serious threat. Power lines were snapped by the wind, leaving many homes without electricity. For some, the lack of power meant no heat during a brutal winter storm. To make matters worse, many of the city's water pumps froze, and this further threatened the water supply. With grocery stores and businesses closed and the roads blocked, food deliveries into the city were severely limited. By December 12th, only 3% of the usual milk supply was able to reach Toronto. To make sure residents had enough, the mayor had to request people to limit their consumption of milk and bread. Emergency food supplies were distributed to fire halls, where people could purchase what they needed. It was a tough time for the people of Toronto, but this was just the beginning of the storm's impact. As the snow continued to fall, it soon became clear that this was going to be one of the most severe storms in Toronto's history, and it would take days, even weeks, for the city to recover. As the storm raged on through December 12th, the situation in Toronto grew more desperate. The city's streets were buried under thick snow, and residents found themselves trapped in their homes or stranded wherever they happened to be. With snowdrifts piling up as high as 3 meters, moving around the city became almost impossible. The government declared that only essential services could be active, and the mayor urged people to stay home unless they absolutely needed to be out. For many, this was not just an inconvenience, it was a crisis. By the morning of December 13th, Toronto had received more than 22 inches or 57 centimeters of snow, and it was clear that the storm wasn't going to let up anytime soon. The wind picked up, making the snow blow even harder, and temperatures continued to plummet, turning everything into a frozen, treacherous landscape. Those who had already been stranded the day before found themselves completely stuck, unable to even get to a store or find warmth. Emergency vehicles and ambulances could barely navigate the snow, and people began to worry about running out of essential supplies like food and fuel. Transportation throughout the city was halted. Only a small number of streetcar lines managed to remain open, but even those had trouble keeping up with the ever-deepening snow. For residents who depended on buses to get around, service was completely suspended. Commuter train services were almost completely blocked, leaving entire neighborhoods isolated. Suburbs like Weston, Leaside, and Long Branch became cut off from the rest of the city, and those stuck in these areas were unable to get help. In some cases, workers were stranded in factories or other workplaces as the roads became impassable. With so many businesses and services closed, the city's ability to function began to break down. Factories that were vital to the war effort, like the Victory Aircraft Plant in Malton, were unable to run because workers couldn't get to work. In fact, some employees found themselves trapped for over 12 hours, spending the night in schools and nearby service stations. The city was essentially on lockdown, with no way to bring in the supplies needed to maintain daily life. The supply of essential goods, especially food and milk, was dangerously low. The snowstorm didn't just impact businesses and transportation. It also affected Toronto's hospitals and emergency services. With ambulances unable to get through to transport patients, hospitals became crowded with people who were injured or sick. The emergency rooms were overflowing, and doctors and nurses worked tirelessly to care for everyone. The storm also kept people inside their homes for longer periods, making it more difficult to deal with common winter illnesses or injuries. The situation was further complicated by the power outages caused by the storm. As the winds picked up, trees and power lines were knocked down, leaving much of the city without electricity. The cold made it almost unbearable for those stuck without heat, and with no way to cook food, many were left depending on whatever supplies they had left in their homes. By the evening of December 12th, the mayor issued a public request for residents to conserve food and water, asking that everyone be cautious about how much they consumed until supplies could be brought back into the city. Despite the massive effort to dig out from under the snow, Some neighborhoods remained completely blocked, with little to no access. People in these areas had to wait for emergency crews to clear the roads, and it wasn't until December 14th that most suburban bus and train services were finally restored. The roads were still covered in snow, and the snow drifts that had buried the streets made travel slow and dangerous. It became clear that this wasn't just a snowstorm, it was a disaster, and it would take much longer for Toronto to recover than anyone had expected. Yet despite the overwhelming challenges, there were signs of hope. People came together, helping their neighbors and working as a community to make it through the storm. The storm was a true test of Toronto's resilience, and even as the city struggled to clear its streets, the citizens' efforts and solidarity during these difficult days would go down in history as an example of the strength of a community in the face of adversity. The people of Toronto would never forget the Great Snowstorm of 1944, as it left a lasting impact on the city and its people, forever changing how they approached future winter storms. By December 15th, Toronto was still reeling from the aftermath of the Great Snowstorm of 1944. Though emergency services and snowplows were making progress in clearing the roads, many areas remained inaccessible. The weight of the snow on rooftops, coupled with the freezing temperatures, caused serious damage across the city. Buildings were collapsing and infrastructure was under immense strain. The municipal government urged residents to stay indoors and not attempt to shovel snow or clear block streets, as the danger of further damage was high. The weather didn't show any signs of relenting. On the morning of December 16th, a new wave of snow began to fall, compounding the already chaotic situation. The city had now been blanketed in over 28 inches of snow, nearly 70 centimeters. The accumulation continued to grow, and the heavy snow resulted in widespread roof collapses in both residential and commercial buildings. Emergency responders had to rush to affected areas, trying to rescue people trapped under fallen debris. It was a race against time, as the freezing temperatures meant that hypothermia and frostbite were major concerns for those caught in the wreckage. In some neighborhoods, residents took matters into their own hands, organizing makeshift rescue teams to help dig out the snow and assist those who were unable to do so themselves. These acts of kindness became a common sight across the city, as people braved the freezing conditions to help one another. The city's hospitals were still overwhelmed with patients, and the lack of medical resources was becoming an increasing concern. Some patients had to be transported by snowmobile or horse-drawn sleds due to the difficulty in getting an ambulance through the snow. Despite these efforts, the healthcare system struggled to keep up with the growing number of injuries, illnesses, and medical emergencies. The storm also had a profound impact on the city's schools. Many schools across Toronto were closed, and students were kept at home for longer than usual. With transportation services still not fully restored, teachers and administrators struggled to reach schools, and even if they managed to make it, the lack of power in many buildings made it impossible to carry out normal classes. For several days, children remained at home, with parents trying to keep them safe and warm as the storm continued. With supply lines still cut off, food shortages were becoming more apparent. Grocery stores had limited stock, and the long lines for what few items were available were a daily occurrence. Residents had to ration what they had, as there was no clear timeline for when regular deliveries would resume. While some stores remained open, they could not offer much in the way of fresh produce or perishable goods. Canned and dried foods were in high demand, and people became inventive with what little they had left. On December 17th, the provincial government declared a state of emergency, allowing additional resources to be deployed to help with the recovery efforts. Plows worked in shifts, clearing major routes and attempting to open up access to the suburbs, but even after days of relentless work, many of the streets remained impassable. The sheer scale of the snowstorm had caught everyone by surprise, and it was evident that it would take weeks to fully recover. Despite these challenges, the resilience of the people continued to shine through. Volunteers organized community kitchens in some neighborhoods, providing hot meals to those who couldn't leave their homes. Many people opened their doors to strangers who needed a place to stay, and local businesses offered what they could to help those in need. In times of such hardship, the sense of community grew stronger, and the people of Toronto showed an incredible spirit of unity. In the weeks that followed, the city slowly started to rebuild. The heavy snow began to subside, and by the end of December, most of the main roads were passable again. The snow plows continued to clear away the remaining drifts, and the sounds of life slowly returned to the city. The Great Snowstorm of 1944 had left an indelible mark on Toronto. and the memory of those harrowing days would stay with the citizens for years to come. The storm had tested the limits of the city's infrastructure, but it also revealed the strength of its people, their ability to adapt, and their unwavering commitment to each other in the face of adversity. By January 3rd, 1945, the worst of the Great Snowstorm of 1944 had finally passed, but the effects were still being felt across Toronto. The damage to homes, businesses, and infrastructure was extensive, and many parts of the city remained without power. With recovery efforts still ongoing, city officials focused on restoring essential services, but the challenges seemed endless. In the aftermath of the storm, numerous organizations came together to assist in the relief efforts, each doing their part to rebuild the city. Emergency shelters had been set up throughout the city, providing temporary housing to those whose homes had been destroyed or rendered uninhabitable due to collapsed roofs. These shelters were vital in offering a safe haven for families, some of whom had been forced to leave their homes and take refuge in community centers and schools. The government, as well as charitable groups, organized relief programs to distribute food, clothing, and basic supplies to those in need. Volunteers worked tirelessly, often braving the cold to help families access what little food and water remained available. Despite the hardships, the people of Toronto continued to demonstrate resilience. Many residents took it upon themselves to check on their neighbors, especially the elderly and vulnerable, making sure that they had access to food and warmth. Some individuals set up informal neighborhood repair teams, assisting those whose homes had suffered significant damage. In a city where many families had already been struggling before the storm, this sense of solidarity was crucial to the community's survival in the months that followed. At the same time, the city faced significant challenges in restoring transportation. The public transit system, which had been a vital part of daily life before the storm, was still in disarray. Snowdrifts remained on many tracks, and buses and streetcars were limited in their ability to navigate the blocked streets. The few vehicles that were able to make it through the snow did so with great difficulty. It wasn't until the second week of January that normal bus routes and streetcar services were gradually reestablished, allowing people to resume their daily routines, though the process was slow. The damage to homes and buildings was far-reaching. Thousands of roofs had collapsed under the weight of the snow, and rebuilding efforts were hampered by a shortage of construction materials. Many families who had been displaced faced the uncertainty of when they could return to their homes. As the snow began to melt, the extent of the damage was laid bare. Streets that had been impassable for days were now filled with debris, with piles of snow and wreckage being cleared away by a combination of workers and volunteers. Though many areas of the city were slowly returning to normal, some parts of Toronto were still without basic services. Water and heating systems had been disrupted in several neighborhoods, and the freezing temperatures made it difficult for families to stay warm. The shortage of fuel meant that people had to ration heating supplies carefully, relying on fireplaces or makeshift stoves to stay warm. Even in places where power had been restored, outages still occurred intermittently, further complicating recovery efforts. By the end of January, the storm's aftermath had begun to take a toll on the mental health of residents. The emotional impact of the storm was immense, with many individuals feeling isolated and overwhelmed by the challenges of rebuilding their lives. Support groups and counselors began to offer their services to those struggling with the emotional effects of the disaster, helping people process their experiences and regain a sense of hope. The winter of 1945 was marked by the continued fight for recovery. In the months following the storm, rebuilding efforts ramped up, and the city began to emerge from the devastation. New measures were put in place to prevent similar damage in future storms, such as reinforcing roofs and improving the snow removal infrastructure. While it would take years to fully recover from the Great Snowstorm of 1944, the resilience of the people of Toronto had been proven time and time again. They had weathered the worst of the storm together and had begun to rebuild their city piece by piece. As the spring of 1945 arrived, the city of Toronto began to show signs of recovery. But the scars left by the Great Snowstorm of 1944 were still visible. The damage was far-reaching, and the storm's effects were felt long after the snow had melted. However, the determination of Toronto's residents to rebuild their city was undeniable. In the face of a disaster that seemed impossible to overcome, the community came together, proving that resilience and unity could overcome even the harshest of circumstances. The rebuilding process took months and in some cases years, but Toronto's infrastructure gradually improved. The experience of the storm led to a greater awareness of the city's vulnerability to extreme weather events, and new measures were introduced to ensure that the city was better prepared for future storms. This included improvements to the public transportation system, more robust construction standards for homes and businesses, and enhanced emergency response protocols. These changes helped make Toronto more resilient in the face of future natural disasters. One of the most lasting legacies of the Great Snowstorm was the sense of community that emerged in the aftermath. People from all walks of life came together to help their neighbors, volunteering their time and resources to aid in recovery efforts. The bonds formed during this challenging period became a symbol of Toronto's strength and solidarity. In the years that followed, this spirit of cooperation remained a central part of the city's identity. By the summer of 1945, much of the damage had been repaired, and life began to return to normal for many residents. Businesses reopened, families returned to their homes, and the streets were once again filled with activity. The storm may have left its mark on Toronto, but it also revealed the power of community, determination, and hope. In the end, the Great Snowstorm of 1944 served as a reminder of the unpredictable forces of nature and the importance of being prepared for the worst. It also highlighted the incredible resilience of Toronto's people, who faced one of the most severe winter storms in history, with courage and unity. While the storm's impact would never be forgotten, it was the collective effort to rebuild and move forward that ultimately defined the city's response to the disaster. As time passed, the memories of the Great Snowstorm faded, but the lessons learned from it continued to shape the city's approach to disaster preparedness and community resilience. Toronto emerged stronger, wiser, and more connected, with a renewed sense of pride in the strength of its people. The storm may have been a dark chapter in the city's history, but it also marked the beginning of a new era of cooperation, rebuilding, and hope for the future.